Good evening. Day 11, telling stories every night, until I get a girlfriend. Tonight, we travel to the Riverlands, to a castle that many travelers crossed, a castle that became one of the most important strategic locations in Westeros, and to a family whose name would one day become associated with one of the most infamous events in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Chapter 1. The Crossing and the Twins. To understand the rise of House Frey, one must first understand the geography of the Riverlands, a region defined by its veins of rushing water, its fertile valleys, and its lack of natural, easily defensible borders. In the northern reaches of these lands flows the Green Fork, a deep, wide, and treacherous branch of the Trident. For hundreds of leagues, the Green Fork cuts through the landscape, creating a formidable barrier for armies, merchants, and travelers alike. In the earlier eras of the Seven Kingdoms, anyone wishing to journey between the north and the southern realms faced a grueling, lengthy detour, either traveling far to the west around the headwaters or risking the dangerous swamps of the Neck. It was this specific geographic reality that birthed the strategic necessity of the crossing. The waters of the Green Fork at this particular juncture run swift and deep, making it impossible to ford on foot or by horse. For centuries, the lords of the Riverlands and the kings of old viewed this stretch of river merely as an obstacle, a boundary that isolated kingdoms and restricted trade. But where others saw only a barrier, the founders of House Frey saw an unparalleled opportunity, an opportunity that would forever alter the geopolitical landscape of Westeros. They recognized that whoever could conquer this river, whoever could bridge the gap between the eastern and western banks, would hold the key to the entire northern continent. The construction of the bridge was not the work of a single lifetime, but rather a monumental undertaking that spanned several generations. It began with the driving of massive timber piles into the shifting riverbed, an exhausting and perilous task that claimed the lives of many early laborers. Over the decades, these temporary wooden structures were replaced by colossal blocks of gray granite, quarried from the hills and floated downriver on sturdy barges. The engineers hired by the early Freys designed a bridge meant to withstand not only the relentless current of the Green Fork, but also the siege engines of envious rivals. As the bridge grew, so too did the fortifications at either end. It was not enough to simply build a roadway across the water. The passage had to be secured against any who might try to seize it by force. Thus, the concept of the Twins was born. On the eastern bank, a massive keep began to rise. Its foundations sunk deep into the earth. Simultaneously, a mirror image of this fortress was constructed on the western bank. These two keeps, identical in their grim, functional architecture, were designed to act as both guardians of the bridge and independent strongholds capable of enduring prolonged assaults. Connecting these twin fortresses was the bridge itself, a wide, secure span of solid masonry. The bridge was wide enough for two stout wagons to pass each other without slowing, ensuring that the flow of commerce would never be bottlenecked. But the brilliance of the design lay in its defensive capabilities. Midway across the span, the Freys erected the water tower, a formidable structure that straddled the bridge, equipped with portcullises, murder holes, and arrow slits. Any army attempting to force its way across would find themselves trapped on a narrow stone strip, exposed to lethal fire from the towers on either side and the fortress in the middle. The strategic importance of this monument cannot be overstated. With the completion of the bridge, The journey between Winterfell and King's Landing was shortened by weeks. The King's Road, the great artery of the realm, relied heavily on the stability of the riverlands, and the crossing became the definitive shortcut for anyone traveling with heavy baggage, trade goods, or large hosts. The Freys had effectively placed a toll booth on the highway of Westeros, forcing kings, lords, and commoners alike to seek their permission before crossing. Trade routes that had once bypassed the northern riverlands were permanently rerouted. Merchants carrying northern furs, timber, and silver down to the rich markets of the south found that paying the Frey toll was far more economical than braving the dangerous coastal waters or the long, bandit-infested mountain passes. In return, southern wine, silk, and grain flowed northward across the Green Fork, each transaction enriching the coffers of the family that sat above the water. The wealth generated by these tolls was immense and immediate. While other noble houses derived their income from the labor of tenant farmers or the yield of silver mines, House Frey accumulated vast treasures simply by existing, by maintaining the stone arches that spanned the river. Every cart, every horseman, and every foot soldier that crossed the Green Fork paid a price in coin, in kind, or in political promises. This steady, inexorable accumulation of gold allowed the Freys to expand their lands, hire mercenary captains, and build a private army that rivaled those of much older, more established houses. Yet, this sudden rise to wealth and power came with a heavy cost to their reputation. The older nobility of the Riverlands, houses that traced their lineages back to the First Men or the Andal invasions, viewed the Freys with deep-seated resentment. To them, the Freys were upstarts, opportunistic toll collectors who had bought their way into lordship rather than earning it through ancient honor or martial deeds on the battlefield. They were often referred to with quiet derision as bridge builders or traders, titles meant to diminish their achievements and remind them of their humble beginnings. Despite the mockery, the reality of the situation remained unchanged. The Twins had become one of the most vital strategic locations in the entire realm. In times of peace, they were the heart of northern trade. In times of war, they were a prize that every general coveted and every king feared to confront. The family that held the keys to the crossing held the power to grant or deny passage to entire kingdoms, a leverage that House Frey would learn to exploit with ruthless efficiency as the centuries rolled on. Chapter 2. Origins of House Frey. The origins of House Frey begin approximately 6 centuries before the War of the Five Kings, a relatively recent timeline when compared to the thousands of years claimed by houses like Stark, Lannister, or Arryn. The founder of the line was not a legendary hero of the Age of Heroes, nor was he a dragon-riding conqueror. He was, by most historical accounts, an ambitious and wealthy man of the merchant class, or perhaps a minor landed knight who possessed an extraordinary eye for terrain and a shrewd understanding of commerce. This founder, whose name has been obscured by time but whose vision remains cast in stone, realized that the lord who controlled the narrowest point of the Green Fork would control the wealth of the region. He used his considerable fortune, accumulated through trade, river shipping, and perhaps less savory enterprises, to purchase the lands on both sides of the crossing. At the time, the grand houses of the era paid little attention to this purchase, viewing the marshy, river-split terrain as largely worthless and difficult to defend. The early years of the family were marked by a relentless drive for survival and recognition. The construction of the first wooden bridge was a declaration of intent. and it immediately drew the ire of neighboring lords who saw their own trade monopolies threatened. The early Freys were forced to defend their half-built structure with sword and shield, fighting off local raiders and rival minor houses that sought to burn the bridge before it could be completed. It was during this period of constant skirmishing that the family developed its pragmatic, survivalist philosophy, a mindset that prioritized walls, wealth, and numbers over abstract notions of chivalry. As the wooden bridge gave way to stone, and the family's wealth multiplied, the Freys began their campaign for social prominence. They understood that gold alone could not buy respect in a feudal society. They needed titles, marriages, and the recognition of the reigning monarchs. They began to use their wealth to secure marriages with older, impoverished houses, trading coin and dowries for ancient names and noble bloodlines. Each alliance, no matter how small, helped to wash away the scent of trade and replace it with the veneer of aristocracy. The relationship between House Frey and their immediate neighbors was always fraught with tension. The Tullys of River Run, who would eventually become the Lords Paramount of the Trident, viewed the Freys as volatile and overly ambitious vassals. While the Tullys ruled through loyalty, alliance, and marriage, the Freys ruled through economic leverage. The Blackwoods, the Brackens, and the Mallisters, houses with deep historical roots in the Riverlands, frequently looked down upon the Freys, excluding them from the inner circles of regional politics whenever possible. This exclusion only served to harden the resolve of House Frey. If they could not win the affection of their peers, they would ensure their dependence. They continued to expand their territory, absorbing smaller manors and farmlands through foreclosure, purchase, or subtle intimidation. Whenever a neighboring lord fell into debt, the Freys were always ready with a loan, quietly acquiring land rights and political favors as collateral. Over generations, their domains grew until they commanded one of the most populous and fertile subregions of the northern Riverlands. The growth of their influence was also fueled by their unique approach to family expansion. Unlike many noble houses that sought to limit their offspring to prevent the division of lands, the Freys embraced large families. They recognized that a vast network of sons, daughters, cousins, and bastards could be deployed across the realm as political agents, marriage candidates, and loyal captains. Every daughter married to a minor knight was an alliance secured. Every son placed in the service of a greater lord was an ear in a foreign court. By the time of Aegon's conquest, House Frey had become too powerful to ignore. When the Targaryens arrived with their dragons, the Freys were among the first of the River Lords to abandon King Harren the Black, joining Edmund Tully in rebellion against the tyrant of Harrenhal. This timely submission to the Dragon Lord secured their position in the New World Order. Aegon the Conqueror confirmed their rights to the Crossing and their lands, officially recognizing them as major lords of the realm under the oversight of House Tully. Yet, even with royal confirmation, the stigma of their origin lingered. They were still the new money of Westeros, a family that had risen through calculation rather than ancient right. This collective insecurity became a defining trait of the Frey psychology. It manifested as a hypersensitivity to insults, a desperate need for external validation, and a deep-seated resentment toward the older houses that slighted them. They became a house that remembered every grievance, no matter how small, waiting patiently for the moment when the balance of power would shift in their favor. Chapter 3. The Twins. The architecture of the Twins is a testament to raw, utilitarian purpose, devoid of the elegant spires of the Eyrie or the ancient magical grandeur of Winterfell. It is a fortress designed by pragmatic minds for a brutal world. The two keeps, sitting opposite each other across the rushing waters of the Green Fork, are built from a uniform, dull gray stone that seems to absorb the damp, misty light of the riverlands. They are squat, massive, and intimidating, featuring thick curtain walls, heavy battlements, and deep moats fed directly by the river. Inside the walls, daily life in the Twins is a bustling, crowded, and often chaotic affair. Because of the family's immense size, the castles are constantly filled to capacity. The Great Hall, known as the Chamber of the Twin Thrones, is a vast, drafts-prone room where the air is frequently thick with the smell of roasting meats, damp dogs, and the ever-present river fog that seeps through the masonry. Unlike the courtly silence of other castles, the Twins are alive with the noise of arguing children, scurrying servants, and the constant clatter of armor from the garrison. The layout of the castles reflects the family's obsession with security and control. Every corridor, every stairwell, and every courtyard is designed to be easily defended if an enemy should ever breach the outer gates. The kitchens, smithies, and stables are duplicated in both keeps, ensuring that if one side of the river should fall to a siege, the other side could function independently for months or even years. This redundancy makes the Twins one of the most difficult strongholds in the realm to reduce through starvation or assault. The defenses of the crossing are multi-layered and formidable. To approach the Twins from either the east or the west, an attacking army must first navigate open, marshy ground that offers no cover from the castle's archers. The main gates are reinforced with iron studs, protected by heavy portcullises and flanking towers that allow defenders to rain boiling oil and stones down upon attackers. Even if a force managed to breach the outer gates of one keep, they would find themselves facing the daunting prospect of fighting across the bridge itself. The bridge is the true killing zone of the fortress. As noted, halfway across the span sits the Water Tower, a self-contained fortress within the bridge. It is equipped with its own heavy iron gates and a portcullis that can be lowered to split the bridge in two. An enemy army that forced its way into the western keep would still have to take the Water Tower, while being fired upon from the eastern keep and from boats on the river below. The structural design ensures that any attempt to take the crossing by storm would result in catastrophic casualties for the attacker. During the many wars that plagued the riverlands throughout history, the Twins served as an immovable anvil. During the Dance of the Dragons, the Freys used their strategic position to control the movement of armies between the North and the Reach, carefully timing their interventions to maximize their own advantage. In the Blackfire rebellions, the Lords of the Crossing weighed their options with cold calculation, ensuring that whatever the outcome, their fortresses would remain unbreached and their tolls would continue to be collected. The river itself is both their greatest protector and their greatest challenge. The Green Fork is prone to seasonal flooding, its waters rising rapidly with the spring thaws or heavy autumn rains. The foundations of the Twins must withstand the immense hydraulic pressure of millions of gallons of rushing water, as well as the debris carried down from the northern forests. The maintenance of the bridge is a constant, expensive chore, requiring a dedicated guild of stonemasons and engineers who work year-round to repair the underwater masonry and ensure the structural integrity of the span. For the small folk who live in the shadow of the towers, the Twins represent stability, but also oppression. The Freys are demanding masters, extracting taxes and labor from the surrounding villages, with the same efficiency they apply to the river tolls. Yet, in times of war, the small folk find safety behind the thick stone walls, knowing that no raider or rogue knight would lightly challenge the defenses of the crossing. The castles stand as a monument to human engineering and political ambition, an artificial barrier that altered the flow of history, just as it altered the flow of the Green Fork. Chapter 4. Lord Walder Frey. No discussion of House Frey can be complete without focusing on the man who came to embody its modern identity, Lord Walder Frey. Born into a house that was already wealthy but still starved for respect, Walder grew up during the reign of King Aerys I Targaryen. As a young boy, he was present at the wedding of Lord Butterwell at Whitewalls, an event that would later be revealed as a cover for the Second Blackfire Rebellion. Even then, historical accounts describe him as a sour, observant child, already displaying the sharp wit and suspicious nature that would define his long life. Walder Frey inherited the lordship of the Crossing as a young man, and he immediately set about consolidating his power with a singular focus on family expansion and political leverage. He possessed an extraordinary vitality, outliving multiple wives, sons, and historical eras. Over the decades, he married 8 times, each union carefully chosen to secure dowries, lands, or political connections with various houses of the Riverlands, the Crown Lands, and beyond. His wives came from houses such as Royce, Swan, Crakehall, and Blackwood. Each marriage a calculated step to weave House Frey into the grand tapestry of the realm's nobility. The result of these numerous marriages was a family tree of unprecedented complexity and size. Lord Walder fathered more than 20 true-born sons and daughters, and an unknown number of natural children, bastards, and grand descendants. By the turn of the century, the twins were teeming with his offspring, creating a domestic environment characterized by intense rivalry and desperate competition for the old man's favor. Walder ruled this vast clan with an iron fist, playing his children against one another to ensure that none could ever challenge his authority. His reputation across Westeros was one of profound distaste, mingled with grudging caution. He was widely known as the late Lord Frey, a moniker bestowed upon him by Hoster Tully during Robert's Rebellion. When the rebel forces clashed with the Royalists on the Trident, Lord Walder delayed his march, arriving with his levies only after the battle had been won and Robert Baratheon had emerged victorious. Walder maintained that his delays were due to logistical difficulties, but the rest of the realm saw it for what it was: a cynical ploy to join the winning side only when the danger had passed. This incident deeply damaged his relationship with his liege lord, Hoster Tully, and further isolated House Frey from the upper echelons of Westerosi politics. Lord Walder felt this slight acutely. He believed that his contribution of 4,000 men to the victorious rebel army deserved high honors and prestigious marriage alliances, particularly with the great houses like Tully, Stark, or Lannister. When these houses rebuffed his overtures, preferring to marry among themselves, Walder's resentment curdled into a cold, enduring malice. Despite his advanced age and physical decline, becoming increasingly frail, gout-ridden, and dependent on his servants, his mind remained as sharp and venomous as a VIP. He sat upon his oak chair in the Twins, watching the world through rheumy eyes, tracking the shifts in the political winds with the precision of a master mariner. He knew exactly how many men he could field, exactly how much food was stored in his granaries, and exactly how much his friendship was worth to those who suddenly found themselves in need of his bridge. To his children, he was a terrifying figure. a patriarch who could disinherit them on a whim, or marry them off to an impoverished hedge knight if they displeased him. He frequently mocked his heirs, reminding them that he might outlive them all, and openly mused about which of his many sons was least incompetent. This toxic family dynamic created a generation of Freys who were desperate for advancement, insecure in their positions, and willing to go to any lengths to secure their futures. As the clouds of war began to gather over Westeros once again following the death of King Robert Baratheon, Lord Walder Frey found himself in a familiar position. He held the key to the north and the Riverlands, and the great players of the realm would once again have to come to his door. This time, however, the old man was determined not to be the late Lord Frey. This time, he would demand a price so high that the great houses would never be able to look down upon his family again. Chapter 5. House Frey, during the War of the Five Kings. The outbreak of the War of the Five Kings placed House Frey at the center of the conflict. Following the arrest and subsequent execution of Lord Eddard Stark in King's Landing, his young son Robb Stark raised the banners of the North and marched south to rescue his father and defend his lands. To relieve the siege of River Run, where Brynden Tully and Edmure Tully were hard-pressed by the Lannister armies, Robb's northern host needed to cross the Green Fork. The only viable path that would allow them to surprise the Lannister forces was the bridge at the Twins. When Robb Stark arrived at the gates of the crossing, he found the castles fully garrisoned and the gates barred. Lord Walder Frey had assembled his 4,000 men, but he had no intention of simply throwing open his doors out of loyalty to House Tully or sympathy for the Starks. He knew that the Lannisters were wealthy, powerful, and ruthless, and that joining the Northern Rebellion was a risk that could lead to the destruction of his house if the Starks were defeated. Catelyn Stark, the daughter of Hoster Tully and mother of Robb, was sent into the Twins alone to negotiate with the prickly old lord. The meeting was a masterclass in political extortion. Lord Walder aired decades of grievances, reminding Lady Catelyn of how her father had slighted him, how the Tully court had mocked him, and how his family had been treated as secondary vassals despite their wealth and power. He made it clear that passage across his bridge would not be bought with gold, but with blood and status. The marriage agreement that emerged from these negotiations was the highest price House Frey had ever extracted. In exchange for granting passage to the Northern Army and contributing his own forces to Robb's cause, Lord Walder demanded that Robb Stark, the heir to Winterfell and soon to be king in the North, marry a daughter or granddaughter of his choosing once the war was won. Furthermore, Arya Stark was to be betrothed to one of Walder's younger sons, and 2 of Walder's grandsons were to be sent to Winterfell as wards, securing their safety and integration into the Northern Court. Robb Stark, desperate to save his family and catch the Lannisters unawares, accepted the terms. The alliance was sealed, and the Frey levies joined the northern host. The immediate results were spectacular. The crossing allowed Robb to divide his forces, surprise Jaime Lannister at the Battle of the Whispering Wood, and lift the siege of River Run. In these early victories, the Frey soldiers and knights fought bravely, shedding their blood alongside the Northmen, and earning a measure of the glory they had long craved. However, the foundations of this alliance were fragile, built on coercion rather than genuine trust or shared ideals. As the war dragged on, political calculations began to shift. The Lannisters, under the shrewd leadership of Lord Tywin, consolidated their power in the south, forming a massive alliance with House Tyrell after the Battle of the Blackwater. The northern cause, once bright with victory, began to look increasingly desperate as the Greyjoys raided the northern coasts and winter approached. The true breaking point came when news reached the twins that King Robb Stark had broken his solemn vow. While recovering from a wound at the crag, the young king had fallen in love with and married Jane Westerling, a daughter of a minor Lannister vassal, effectively discarding his pact with House Frey. When the news arrived at the crossing, the fury of Lord Walder was cold and absolute. He viewed this not just as a political setback, but as the ultimate insult to his family's honor. A public declaration by the king in the north that a daughter of House Frey was not fit to be his queen. The Frey forces immediately withdrew from Robb's army, returning to the twins in silent outrage. The alliance was shattered, and the northern war effort was dealt a crippling blow. Robb Stark, realizing the gravity of his mistake in facing military collapse, sought to repair the breach. He sent emissaries to the twins, offering apologies and suggesting an alternative alliance, that Lord Edmure Tully, the new Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, would marry Roslyn Frey, one of Walder's prettiest daughters, in Robb's stead. Lord Walder appeared to relent, inviting the king in the north, his mother, and his entire army back to the twins to celebrate the wedding and renew their pact. It seemed to the world that the old lord was prepared to accept a grand apology and a highly advantageous marriage for his daughter. But behind the closed gates of the twins, a very different plot was being woven. A conspiracy born of wounded pride, secret letters from Tywin Lannister, and a ruthless desire to permanently alter the hierarchy of the Riverlands. Chapter 6. The Red Wedding. The events that took place within the walls of the twins during the wedding of Edmure Tully and Roslyn Frey would forever alter the moral and political fabric of Westeros. It began under the guise of ancient tradition and reconciliation. As Robb Stark and his lords arrived at the gates, they were welcomed by Lord Walder, who offered them bread and salt, the traditional symbols of guest right. By consuming these tokens, both host and guest entered into a sacred covenant, protected by the laws of gods and men, guaranteeing that no harm would come to them while under the host's roof. The wedding itself was a grand, boisterous affair, designed to lull the Northmen into a state of false security. The great hall was filled with music, wine, and laughter. The Frey hosts were attentive, pouring flagons of ale and wine for the northern captains, encouraging them to drink heavily and celebrate the newfound peace. Outside the castle walls, in the sprawling camps along the riverbank, the thousands of northern soldiers were treated to a massive feast of their own, provided with barrels of wine by the Freys to toast their king. Yet, beneath the celebration, the trap was being meticulously sprung. The musicians playing in the gallery were not simple minstrels, but crossbowmen and soldiers in disguise. The wine served to the northern lords was deliberately potent, intended to dull their reflexes and slow their wits. As the night progressed and the traditional bedding ceremony took place, with Edmure and Roslyn being carried off to their bridal chamber, the atmosphere in the great hall began to shift, growing tense and heavy. The signal for the slaughter was the playing of a specific song. The Rains of Castamere, the grim anthem of House Lannister that commemorated Tywin Lannister's destruction of the rebellious Rains of Castamere. As the haunting melody filled the chamber, the doors to the great hall were barred from the outside, trapping the unsuspecting northern lords within. Before the Northmen could comprehend the meaning of the music, the musicians dropped their instruments and drew their weapons. The violence that followed was swift, coordinated, and merciless. Crossbow bolts rained down from the gallery, striking down lords and knights where they sat at the feast tables. Catelyn Stark watched in horror as her son's personal guard was butchered in seconds. Robb Stark himself was struck multiple times, bleeding upon the floor. In the camps outside, a similar slaughter was unfolding. The Frey forces, along with their secret co-conspirators, the Boltons, fell upon the drunk and unarmed northern soldiers, setting fire to their tents and turning the riverbank into a killing field. Inside the hall, despite her desperation, Lady Catelyn attempted to negotiate, seizing Walder Frey's young, simple-minded wife and threatening her life if Robb was not allowed to leave. But the old lord's heart was stone. He watched the carnage with detached amusement, famously replying that he would find another wife. Moments later, Roose Bolton stepped forward and drove his sword through Robb Stark's heart, delivering the final blow on behalf of the Lannister alliance. The slaughter did not spare the servants, the knights, or the High Lords. Catelyn Stark's throat was slit, her body later stripped and thrown naked into the Green Fork, a final act of desecration that mirrored the ancient burial customs of her family, but stripped of all honor. The king in the north was decapitated, and the head of his loyal direwolf, Grey Wind, was sewn onto his torso in a grotesque mockery of his royal title. The political consequences of this betrayal were immediate and profound. By orchestrating the Red Wedding, House Frey had successfully destroyed the Northern Rebellion in a single night. They had eliminated the king in the north, captured the Lord Paramount of the Riverlands, and broken the back of the regional resistance. In the eyes of the Iron Throne, they were heroes who had ended a costly civil war without risking a single royal soldier. For their service to the crown, the Freys were lavishly rewarded. The Iron Throne granted Riverrun to Sir Emmon Frey, Walder's second son, stripping House Tully of their ancestral seat and title. Furthermore, the family's position in the Riverlands was elevated to unprecedented heights, their influence backed by the full military might of House Lannister and the newly appointed Wardens of the North, House Bolton. Yet, this victory was achieved by committing the ultimate sin in Westerosi society, the violation of guest right. By harming guests who had eaten their salt and slept under their roof, House Frey had broken a taboo that transcended laws and kingdoms. They had invoked the wrath of both the old gods and the new, earning a reputation for treachery and dishonor that no amount of gold, land, or royal decrees could ever erase. Chapter 7. Consequences and Decline. The immediate aftermath of the Red Wedding saw House Frey at the peak of their material power, but their long-term decline began the very moment the blood dried on the floors of the Great Hall. The concept of guest right was not merely a polite social custom. It was the foundation of trust in a brutal world where words were often wind. By shattering this sacred boundary, the Freys made themselves permanent outcasts in the political landscape of the Seven Kingdoms. No lord could ever truly trust a Frey contract. No king could rely on their loyalty, and no house could form an alliance with them without fearing a knife in the dark. The loss of honor manifested first in the small, daily interactions of the realm. Frey knights and messengers traveling through the Riverlands found themselves treated with cold, silent hostility by the small folk and minor nobility. Innkeepers refused them service, blacksmiths overcharged them for horseshoes, and traveling companions abandoned them on the road. The name Frey became a curse, a synonym for cowardice, greed, and low treachery. More dangerously, the Red Wedding created an army of silent, vengeful enemies. The families of the northern lords who had been butchered at the Twins did not forget their dead. Houses like Manderley, Umber, and Serwyn harbored a deep, burning desire for vengeance, waiting for the opportunity to strike back. In the Riverlands, the remnants of the broken rebel armies formed outlaw bands, most notably the Brotherhood Without Banners, who began a guerrilla war against Frey patrols and supply lines, hanging any bridge builder they could capture. The occupation of Riverrun proved to be a political nightmare for the family. Sir Emmon Frey, who had been granted the castle, possessed none of his father's intelligence or authority. He found himself ruling over a hostile population that despised him, surrounded by Tully loyalists who looked at him with open contempt. The castle had to be maintained by a permanent garrison, draining the resources of the Twins and exposing the family to constant threat of rebellion or assassination. Within the Twins themselves, the domestic situation deteriorated into toxic paranoia. Lord Walder's health continued to fail, and the certainty of his approaching death triggered a vicious internal struggle among his heirs. Sons plotted against brothers, cousins poisoned the ears of their uncles, and everyone lived in fear that the old man would die before they could secure their inheritance. The unity that had allowed House Frey to function effectively during the war was replaced by a factional warfare that threatened to tear the family apart from within. The Lannister alliance, which had promised so much security, began to fray as King's Landing fell into chaos following the assassination of King Joffrey and the subsequent death of Lord Tywin. Without the iron hand of Tywin Lannister to protect them, the Freys found themselves exposed to the changing political tides. The new rulers in the capital viewed the Freys as an embarrassing liability, a family of dishonorable upstarts whose actions had permanently damaged the credibility of the crown. The psychological toll on the younger generation of Freys was significant. Born into a family of immense wealth, they found themselves isolated from the rest of Westerosi society. They could not travel to tournaments without being mocked. They could not seek prestigious marriages without being rebuffed. And they could not walk through their own lands without fearing a crossbow bolt from the woods. They had become prisoners of their own infamy, living behind a thick wall, while the world outside slowly turned against them. The decline was not marked by a grand, dramatic siege, but by a slow, agonizing erosion of their authority. Every month brought news of another Frey knight found dead in a ditch, another supply wagon intercepted, or another son disappearing into the river mists. The great wealth of the crossing was increasingly spent on security, mercenaries, and bribes to maintain a fragile hold on their territory, while the specter of northern vengeance continued to loom large on the horizon. Chapter 8. Legacy of House Frey. The legacy of House Frey in the history of the Seven Kingdoms is one written in gray stone and red ink, a cautionary tale of ambition uncoupled from honor. In the centuries to come, Masters of the Citadel would study their rise and fall as a classic example of how geopolitical advantage can be completely undone by a lack of moral restraint. They are remembered not for the monumental achievement of their bridge, but for the tragedy that took place within their halls. Westeros remembers them as the architects of a dark precedent. Before the Red Wedding, even the most brutal civil wars had boundaries. Lords surrendered knowing their lives would be spared for ransom, and embassies were conducted under the banner of peace. By proving that even the most sacred customs could be discarded for political gain, the Freys contributed to a harsher, more cynical world, where total annihilation became the default strategy for resolving conflict. Their place in history is permanently linked with that of the Starks, acting as the dark mirror to the northern ideals of honor and loyalty. While the Starks are remembered for their tragic adherence to duty, the Freys are remembered for their short-sighted pragmatism. The history books note that while the Starks lost a kingdom but retained the love and loyalty of their people, the Freys gained a province but lost their humanity and their future. The lessons of House Frey's rise and fall are profound. They demonstrated that wealth and strategic geography can build a powerful house, but they cannot build a lasting dynasty without the respect of one's peers. Power derived purely from extortion and fear is inherently unstable, requiring constant maintenance and generating an endless cycle of resentment that will eventually consume those who wield it. The physical monument of their ambition, the twins, remains standing, an iron-hard barrier across the Green Fork. But the castles have lost their grandeur, viewed by while the world outside slowly turned against them. The decline was not marked by a grand, dramatic siege, but by a slow, agonizing erosion of their authority. Every month brought news of another Frey knight found dead in a ditch, another supply wagon intercepted, or another son disappearing into the river mists. The great wealth of the crossing was increasingly spent on security, mercenaries, and bribes to maintain a fragile hold on their territory, while the specter of northern vengeance continued to loom large on the horizon. Chapter 8. Legacy of House Frey. The legacy of House Frey in the history of the Seven Kingdoms is one written in gray stone and red ink, a cautionary tale of ambition uncoupled from honor. In the centuries to come, Meisters of the Citadel would study their rise and fall as a classic example of how geopolitical advantage can be completely undone by a lack of moral restraint. They are remembered not for the monumental achievement of their bridge, but for the tragedy that took place within their halls. Westeros remembers them as the architects of a dark precedent. Before the Red Wedding, even the most brutal civil wars had boundaries. Lords surrendered knowing their lives would be spared for ransom, and embassies were conducted under the banner of peace. By proving that even the most sacred customs could be discarded for political gain, the Freys contributed to a harsher, more cynical world, where total annihilation became the default strategy for resolving conflict. Their place in history is permanently linked with that of the Starks, acting as the dark mirror to the northern ideals of honor and loyalty. While the Starks are remembered for their tragic adherence to duty, the Freys are remembered for their short-sighted pragmatism. The history books note that while the Starks lost a kingdom but retained the love and loyalty of their people, the Freys gained a province but lost their humanity and their future. The lessons of House Frey's rise and fall are profound. They demonstrated that wealth and strategic geography can build a powerful house, but they cannot build a lasting dynasty without the respect of one's peers. Power derived purely from extortion and fear is inherently unstable, requiring constant maintenance and generating an endless cycle of resentment that will eventually consume those who wield it. The physical monument of their ambition, the twins, remains standing, an iron-hard barrier across the Green Fork. But the castles have lost their grandeur, viewed by travelers not as an engineering marvel, but as a grim, haunted monument to treachery. The stones themselves seem to carry the weight of the blood spilled within them, a permanent reminder to all who pass that some victories are far more costly than defeat. In the songs of the small folk and the stories told to children on winter nights, the name Frey became a bogeyman, a warning against greed and broken promises. The old lords of the Riverlands, who had once been forced to pay the Frey tolls, lived to see the family's name dragged through the mud, vindicating their ancient disdain for the upstarts of the crossing. The bridge builders had successfully crossed the river of history, but they had drowned their house in the process. Chapter 9. Closing. And so we arrive at the end of the story of House Frey. From ambitious river lords who grew wealthy by controlling a vital crossing, to one of the most influential families in the Riverlands. Their rise was built on strategy and patience, but their downfall came from the choices they made to preserve that power. And as the waters continue to flow beneath the Twins, the ancient bridge remains, quietly watching the passage of time, just as it has for generations. And now, it is time to leave the rivers and castles of Westeros behind, to close your eyes and let the night carry you into peaceful rest. Sleep well.